China has hit back against Donald Trump's tariffs, vowing to fight to the end. How far are both sides willing to go in this trade war? That is the question we'll be asking on this episode of Newscast. Hello, it's James in the Newscast studio, and yesterday, as we were discussing the impact of President Trump's tariffs on the whole world, pretty much as we were recording, the president said he was going to go even further, potentially, and slap even tougher tariffs on China. And then on Monday night, we had China's response to that, and they were not lying down. They said they were going to fight to the end. So it looks like this trade war is intensifying. And so to discuss that and the implications of that, we're joined by Sophia Gaston, who is a research fellow at King's College London. Hello, Sophia.
Hi.
And also with us is the author and former foreign correspondent for Channel 4 News, Ian Williams, who has a new book, which is called Vampire State, The Rise and Fall of the Chinese Economy. Hello, Ian.
Hi, James.
Right. So, first of all, Sophia, overnight, we have this quote from Beijing that it has vowed to fight to the end when it comes to tariffs. It seems pretty tough language. What do you make of it? Surprised?
Well, not surprised. I think it was interesting when Donald Trump first was inaugurated, there were these sort of first few weeks where both Beijing and Washington were kind of sizing each other up. And actually, when Trump announced his initial tariffs towards China alongside Mexico and Canada, the Chinese response to that was actually relatively restrained. So it's clear they were still sort of sizing things up, seeing what happened. Once that second round of tariffs, and then it became quite clear that there was a sort of escalatory intent from President Trump to that, China has hit back very, very strongly, not just targeting tariffs themselves, but also some other non-tariff elements, really tightening the screws of its regulatory framework to really impact American businesses, disrupt their supply chains, antitrust cases, all the rest of it. So I think Beijing is saying we will go head to head, and this is not going to be the case where with all the other American allies, you know, they're coming to kiss the ring. China is saying we're a formidable opponent here.
And Ian, President Trump seems to be talking just as tough from his perspective as well, saying he's no intention of pausing these tariffs for any length of time. He says in capital letters, China played it wrong, is what he says. Look, how sustainable is this for either country? It's like a game of chicken, isn't it?
It is, and the Chinese reaction has been contradictory in some senses, because you've had Xi Jinping there presenting himself as a bastion of stability for world trade, a symbol of globalization, criticizing America for bullying and coercion and rule breaking, which is pretty rich because China's rise has depended on all three of those. But he's nevertheless concentrated on trying to sound reasonable, trying to sound the grown up in the room. And it's only more recently that he has changed tone and presented himself as someone that's not going to be pushed around and will go toe to toe with the Americans on this.
And just to go, Sophia, back to basics for a second about the US-China relationship. I mean, it's a curious one, isn't it? Because on the one hand, here you have two countries tussling for global supremacy on the world stage. And on the other hand, countries that are really quite dependent on each other in terms of trade. How dependent are they?
Very entangled. And I think, there has obviously been this process towards divestment, decoupling of supply chains and so on over recent years, with the United States and its allies seeking to have greater sovereignty and independence from China, because the extraordinary way in which China was able to monopolize dominance over really vital supply chains obviously started to become seen to be a bit of a structural weakness. But with all of that taking place, the US and China remain very entangled on many levels, as we all do. And I think what we're likely to see here with the impact that these tariffs are having on the wider global economy, there will be enormous kind of structural shifts that affect all of us. So nothing's ever really fully bilateral these days.
But politically, do you think, because of the political system, I mean, China's obviously not a democracy, the United States is a democracy. OK, Donald Trump himself will not have to seek re-election, albeit he has suggested that he would seek a third term, which he cannot do by law. But can China take this pain for longer if it does suffer pain domestically because of its political system, do you think?
Well, if it's quite funny if you think back to the sort of 90s when we were all extremely optimistic, and you think about that moment with China being brought into the World Trade Organization. I think there was this hope that China could become more like America. It could become a democracy through opening up its markets. It would open up its society. The risk we have now is that the United States starts to become more like China. And the thing is that the Chinese have been anticipating these forces for quite some time. And so they've been very clever at developing what's called a dual circulation strategy. So on the one hand, with their sort of external facing economy, they're seeking to actually reduce their dependence on others, but increase others' dependence on them. And then internally, they've been trying to grow domestic demand, consumer demand, become more self-sufficient. And that's actually very similar to what the United States is actually seeking to do with its economy now.
And Ian, on that point, how's China doing with that? Because and I'm no expert, and I'm some newscasters as ever will be experts, but many won't be. Is China not struggling a bit in terms of that domestic demand and other issues? I read they had problems with housing, for example. How is China doing domestically in terms of the economy?
Not well. I mean, Sophia's got a good point there, but I think that the economy is very weak. It's been the model which has driven the Chinese economy to this date over the last few decades is very much obsolete now. There was an over-reliance on property. The property sector is now collapsing. It was a quarter of the economy. There was an over-reliance on investment in infrastructure, heavy investment, an over-reliance on exports, which there still is. And in fact, Xi sees exports as a way of getting out of this. And as Sophia pointed out, the notion of decoupling, as it's now called in Washington, was really very much invented in Beijing perhaps a decade ago, with this decision to try and separate the Chinese economy, to make the Chinese economy less reliant on America in particular, but globally. But we have seen enormous economic problems in China, from the property bubble bursting to youth unemployment. There aren't many companies which are solvent, and that doesn't just mean in the property sector. Not many companies are making money. It is in growth rates have plummeted, so has inward investment. We've seen Xi just in the last 2 or 3 weeks appealing to foreign companies to come back to China, appealing to his own entrepreneurs and tech bosses, having spent the previous decade pretty much alienating all of them by making it much more difficult to do business in China. So I think that while he has sought to make the Chinese economy more resilient, perhaps in anticipation of this sort of event, although I think not even Xi would have thought that the challenge would be quite as big as it is by these high tariffs. I think the economy is very fragile, and I think they're in less of an ability in China to withstand a really serious trade war than the United States is. But politically, you are right that China's not a democracy. Yes, it's relied on what you might call performance legitimacy in the absence of any elections. But nevertheless, it doesn't have to go back to the voters. So its ability to weather economic difficulties shouldn't be underestimated.
There are also going to be opportunities for China from this situation, and I think a couple of them are clear. The first is that the United States becoming a more transactional partner to its traditional allies certainly is encouraging some of its allies to think about China in more favorable economic terms. And I think that's actually a profoundly dangerous development. It goes against both America's interests and, I think, America's allies' interests. But I think there's certainly room for countries, particularly in Europe, to start to think more about deepening those economic and investment relations with China. And that would be a kind of a bitter irony for the United States of its actions if that does transpire. The other big opportunity for China is going to be in the Indo-Pacific. So it's surrounded by really fast-growing dynamic economies there, and many of those have been the hardest hit by Trump's tariffs here. So it is possible for China to capitalize on this by offering preferential trading relations with its neighbors. And that, again, would be a huge own goal for the United States, which has sought to maintain its security dominance in the region, also through having a very strong economic footprint there.
So here's a question. How does President Xi actually feel domestic pressure without the rigor of democracy, if at all? How does it affect him?
Well, we saw with the zero COVID policy, this extremely draconian COVID rules that President Xi had kept in force for an enormous amount of time in China, well beyond the opening up of pretty much every other global economy. And at some point, there just was an enormous backlash. And we were seeing this in all sorts of domestic protest movements. They obviously have to be extremely subtle, carefully executed, because there's profound censorship and, quite totalitarian surveillance systems. But it was visible and obvious to the point that it had actually reached up to the leadership. And under that pressure, he did take a snap decision to then reopen society and the economy pretty much overnight. And so I think that's an example of the fact that, he's not entirely impervious to domestic pressure. It's just that it has to be sustained, coordinated, and something that touches across a large enough portion of society.
That is an interesting point. And Ian, I have a specific question for you about China's neighbours, some of its neighbours or near neighbours, in terms of this idea that to avoid some of the tariffs, and let's not forget the tariffs go back to President Trump's first term and indeed were increased by President Biden, some tariffs, but that to avoid some of the impact of that Chinese companies have been funneling their goods through places such as Vietnam, Malaysia and Thailand. So I just wonder what now, not just for China, but in your view, Ian, for those economies, how damaging is what's happening now?
I think this will have been one of the more profound shocks to China in these tariffs, because there have been a number of preparations going on. China's been looking at ways ways of dealing with potential tariffs for some time to try and make the economy more resistant. And one key element of that was outward investment to reduce reliance on the American market. And I think the proportion of exports going to America have fallen from almost 20% to just under 15% of China's total exports. They've invested quite massively in Southeast Asia. And Vietnam is a very interesting case in point. I visited there when I was writing the most recent book. And it's surprising, given the history, quite a hostile history between those two countries, that China had become one of the biggest investors in Vietnam. People depict Vietnam as being sort of an alternative for China, China plus one, where companies diversifying their supply chain. So why would China do that? Why would Chinese companies do that? Well, the answer was that a lot of those factories were merely bolting together Chinese components. They were an extension of the Chinese supply chain. So these were assembly centers for Chinese components, or they were simply places where they were relabeled as made in Vietnam. And this was going on a massive scale, transshipment, you could call it, through Vietnam. The same thing has happened to a slightly lesser extent in Malaysia and Thailand. And this has meant that in trying to, if your policy in Washington is to try and put tariffs on Chinese goods, you're engaged in a giant game of whack-a-mole, because where are they going to pop up next? And this has been going on an enormous scale. And of course now, whether it's motivated by Washington rumbling this was going on, I'm not so sure whether we can read that much sort of sense into these tariffs. But nevertheless, you've suddenly got enormous tariffs, 46% on Vietnam, 34% on Thailand, 24% on Malaysia. And it would not surprise me at all that if there were negotiations to try and bring bring those tariffs down, one of the conversations would be about curtailing the transshipment of Chinese goods through these neighboring countries.
I just wanted to ask you one thing, just a specific thing, because they're so big, these companies, and we haven't mentioned them at all. Apple and Tesla. What does all of this mean for those giant companies and their famous bosses?
I think that is a very, very intriguing question, because these two companies have an enormous dependence on the Chinese market, both to sell their stuff, but also as a manufacturing base. They are tempting targets because of the status they have. But at the same time, they've both been extremely useful to the Chinese Communist Party, to the development of the Chinese economy. In Apple's case, they have the world's most sophisticated supply chain based in China. And that's not just benefited Apple, it's benefited China as it's turned itself into an electronic powerhouse. Tesla received multiple favors from the government, from state banks, in order to set up near Shanghai, largely because China wanted to create that supply chain to help its own EV industry, and also to have R&D centers and other such thing in China. And it's been very successful because BYD is now challenging Tesla, and if you like, the company that helped create it. So they've been very useful for China.
Just one final thing, Sophia, because we're talking about a trade war, but there's actual wars going on in the world, I'm sorry to say, as everybody knows, and newscasters know because we've talked about them all a lot. Ukraine's president, Volodymyr Zelensky, has said that 2 Chinese soldiers have been captured while fighting in eastern Ukraine. Now, this is almost an entirely separate topic, but what do we know about that, and what does that tell us?
It's an extraordinary story that's emerged this afternoon. We're obviously very well versed on the fact that North Korea has sent troops to fight alongside Russian forces against Ukraine. These are 2 captured Chinese soldiers, again fighting on the Russian side. But I think what we don't yet know is whether or not these are just enthusiastic volunteers, in the same way that people from all over the world have volunteered, including from Britain, in this conflict, although, of course, in that case on the side of Ukraine, whether they're paid mercenaries or whether there is some involvement from the Chinese state. I would be extremely surprised if the Chinese state had been involved in this, because they have been so carefully treading this line about how they have been supporting Russia. They've been providing enormous amounts of financial support to its economy, delivering all sorts of vital infrastructure and material, but they have not given hard power weapons, and they have not sent troops to support Russia. So I think this is probably a case of just some rather enthusiastic Chinese citizens there of their own volition. And I'm sure the Chinese government will be rather keen to see this issue go away quite quickly.
It's definitely one we'll keep an eye on. Sophia, lovely to talk to you. Thanks for coming in on Newscast.
Thanks for having me.
Ian, really nice to talk to you. Thank you very much.
A pleasure.
Now, another President Trump-related news. The US leader says that his country and Iran are to hold what he has described as direct talks about a nuclear deal. Now, Lyse Doucet, our chief international correspondent, is here to talk about that. Hello, Lyse.
James, always good to see you. But it seems, am I right in saying that when we often sit down together, it's because there's been a bolt out of the blue, like this one? President Trump suddenly announcing that there were, and he put it, almost the highest level talks between Iran and the United States. And in his very Trumpian way said a very big meeting is going to happen on Saturday. And then in the middle of the night, I think in Iran, hours later, Iran's foreign minister Abbas Araghchi said, no. Yes, there will be talks in Oman, which President Trump hadn't revealed, but they will be indirect. And this has now started us on asking what's going to happen and what can be achieved.
And you're hoping to go?
Yes, and this is a whole new terrain for Oman. Oman has traditionally been known as the very quiet, behind the scenes mediator in conflicts in the Middle East before Saudi Arabia and Qatar and others got involved. So for many years, it has been playing behind the roll scene secret talks between Iran and the United States, because diplomatic relations were broken off after the 1979 Iranian Revolution. But I wonder whether even the Omanis were startled when it was announced that they would be taking place in Oman. So yes, we're hoping to go and waiting to see if the Omanis will let us in to report to them and how much access there will be.
And maybe not just startled by the location, as you suggest, but startled at this bolt from the blue at all. I mean, where do you think this has come from? You never get a chance to breathe with President Trump. Tariffs, 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 China, 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 and now it's Iran. What do you think is going on here in terms of the White House?
We do know that there were moves to try to arrange some kind of dialogue between Iran and the United States. President Trump has repeatedly made it clear during his election campaign since he came to office that he would like to talk to Iran, that he would like a deal. And he always hints that, in fact, more than hints, that this is not the option preferred by many of his aides. They would like him, and I should include this in this, Prime Minister Netanyahu of Israel, to hit Iran really hard. But President Trump always says, no, that would be really dangerous. I don't want to, kill people. Let's try to talk.
Lyse, remind us of not the entire history of US-Iranian relations, but, why a nuclear deal? What is the issue here? There was a deal under President Obama. Just take us back a little bit and remind us why we're talking about this at all.
For months and months, and I remember going from capital to capital, from Central Asia across Europe, there were multilateral negotiations between world powers and Iran over their nuclear program, only the nuclear program, which resulted in a landmark nuclear deal of 2015. It was regarded as a huge achievement. Not perfect, but the best that could be achieved. When President Trump came to power, he said, I'm getting out of that deal. So he unilaterally pulled out in 2018, partly because he said, I can do a better deal, partly because he didn't like certain aspects of it. And so if there are direct talks between Iran and the United States, it will be the first face-to-face talks since since President Trump pulled out of that deal. And it comes at a time, as we've discussed here before, the region is dramatically different, and so too is Iran's nuclear program.
Yeah. Well, before we get into that, and it is interesting to get into both of those things, what the nuclear program looks like and why Iran is weaker now, I think would that be fair to say, than it has been in recent years. Let's have a listen to the president, first of all. This was last night, that is to say Monday night, where it's one of these classic moments we're becoming so used to, where he's in
hot seat.
Yes, he's in the White House sitting next to another leader. All the journalists are trying to throw questions. It's a bit chaotic. But he's being asked here whether, if diplomacy fails, the US, under his leadership, would take military action against Iran and its nuclear program.
I think if the talks aren't successful with Iran, I think Iran is going to be in great danger. And I hate to say it, great danger, because they can't have a nuclear weapon.
What is the status, as far as we can tell, of Iran's nuclear program and its desire, fair to say, to get the bomb?
Iran's supreme leader, who is the top power in the Islamic Republic of Iran, Ayatollah Khamenei, has always said that they will not acquire a nuclear weapon. He said there was a fatwa, an Islamic decree against it. Most intelligence agencies will say that they don't believe Iran has made the decision yet to cross that line. And there are those who think that it couldn't happen while the aging supreme leader is still alive. The way Iran is described now, and this was the consequences of President Trump pulling out of that imperfect deal, is that Iran is described as a threshold state, that it's believed that it is in a position now where within weeks it could produce enough fuel, enrich enough fuel for an actual weapon, and then it would take months in order for it to develop the capability to turn that into a nuclear weapon if it decided to do so. Now, in recent months, and this is part of the other question you asked, as part of what Iran used to call its forward defenses, its allies across the Middle East, Hezbollah in Lebanon, militias in Iraq and Syria, President Assad of Syria, what's happening in Gaza with Hamas. As those have been weakened, if not in some cases almost destroyed, Iran has started thinking, well, how can we defend ourselves? And there's been a lot of debate as to whether or not there are forces in Iran, including in the powerful Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, saying, well, the only weapon we really can have is a nuclear weapon. But so far, they have not taken that decision, which is why all of this discussion now with the critics saying that they should hit Iran now, it's at its weakest, and others who are saying, no, the only way to go about this is to go back to the negotiating table. A deal was done before. We should try to do it again, despite the fact that it will be difficult and it may not be in the realm of possibility.
So when I say desire, that's not necessarily fair, a desire to get the bomb, or at least if it is, it's certainly hotly disputed in the secret.
Yes,
They
now say they haven't crossed that line yet, but it is in the debate, in the dialogue, in the discussion, in a way that it has not been before. And also because technically Iran is in a different position than before.
So you mentioned there some of Iran's partners, proxies, clients, if you want, whatever you want to call them, throughout the region. Can you paint a picture with your vast experience in the Middle East as to where Iran stands now? Because it's been a very dramatic last couple of years, hasn't it? A lot has changed. And am I right in saying Iran is quite a bit weaker than it was? Is that fair?
Iran, I think empirically we would have to say, and politically we would have to say that Iran is a lot weaker. It's so-called, what it called its axis of resistance, its ring of fire. Those fires across the region are not burning so brightly. In fact, I think for our podcasters, what they probably most hear about is the Houthis way away from the region, from Yemen, who are still firing missiles into Israel. They're not a proxy in the way that Hezbollah of Lebanon was a proxy of Iran. Hezbollah and Iran were very much, an umbilical cord between the two of them. But the Houthis are a very key ally of Iran. The Houthis depend on Iran for a lot of military assistance. But Iran knows it doesn't have the same firepower as before. Secondly, our podcasters may remember the extraordinary direct strikes, Iran against Israel, Israel against Iran. And the last Israeli strike, while there was a lot of attention was said, it's a very limited strike, they don't want to escalate. The general assessment is that Israel did take out a lot of Iran's air defenses, so that Iran is much more exposed. So if President Trump did act on his threat to take military action, Iran would not be in a very good position to actually defend itself. And it's very exposed.
Right. That's really interesting. And I mentioned a minute ago, and newscasters will have noticed my big omission. I mentioned that President Trump was sitting next to another leader in the White House, not just any old leader, but Prime Minister Netanyahu of Israel, who, as you hinted at earlier, Lyse, many people think really would just love to hammer Iran and hammer its nuclear program for good. Is that the Israeli position?
The Prime Minister Netanyahu has always said that. It's always said, well, he talks the talk, but actually pulls back from the brink. But Iran, the threat posed by Iran to the Jewish state, has defined his entire political career. He has always said, and especially now in this moment continues to say, the root cause of all of our problems in the Middle East is Iran, is its proxies, and until we deal with what they see as this real cancer in the region will never be secure. We don't know what they talked about behind the scenes, but it's been noted that how little Prime Minister Netanyahu said during his moment sitting beside President Trump. But one of the things he did say was that he said when it comes to a nuclear deal with Iran, he said we want to see the Libya model. This is something the newscasters may start hearing more about. The Libya model, people may remember during Prime Minister Tony Blair's time, was when Libya gave up up its nuclear weapons. They literally were in a box and shipped out. That will never happen in Iran. First of all, Iran's nuclear program is not in boxes. Some of it is underground, hard to destroy, can only be destroyed with the most powerful weapons that only the United States has. And Iran, it's part of its national pride. It will say that it has a right, its sovereign right, to have its own nuclear program. So if that is what Prime Minister Netanyahu believes, if that is what he has convinced President Trump to believe, then there's just simply no way. And the other thing I should mention is that President Trump will also be worried about Iran's ballistic missile program. There was criticism that in the first nuclear deal, this was not part of it. But the negotiators at the time said, listen, we have a UN Security Council mandate to discuss only the nuclear program. But Iran has made a big point, because this is often about perception, isn't it, as what is actually on the ground. They've recently announced they had developed new ballistic missiles, powerful enough, they made clear, everyone heard them, can reach Israel. They also have a very successful drone program. Their drones being supplied to Russia to be used in Ukraine have also been very controversial. So that is another part of the program. And while we have to wait for confirmation, but we believe that when Iran goes to the table, whether talking directly or indirectly, it will want to discuss the nuclear program. That's it.
Final thought. President Trump's been in post for 3 months now, pretty much. And in that time, we've seen him say, he's going to deal with the Israel-Gaza conflict, Israel-Hamas, if you prefer. He's going to deal with the Ukraine-Russia war. Then he's had this extraordinary tariffs policy that's thrown the entire world markets and arguably the world economy into turmoil. Now he's talking about the Iran nuclear deal. I mean, the pace of what he's doing and the scale of some of these challenges that he's saying he will tackle. I mean, the proof of the pudding's in the eating as to whether he will actually do any of this or sort any of it out. What do you think of it, Lyse? Just the extraordinary pace and scale of President Trump's actions in the White House in his second term.
Well, this has already been described as flooding the zone, keeping everyone completely dizzied by all of these things happening all at once. And perhaps this, again, is he's also adding to this vortex, throwing something in as everyone's worried about tariffs. He throws Iran into the mix. President Trump has never said that's his way of doing it, but that's been the observation, that this is deliberate. And on top of that, not only is President Trump putting all these world crises on the table, which he thinks he can do the deal better than anyone else, he's using the same person, his golf buddy, a real estate developer with no experience in mediation. President Trump sees that as an advantage. He says, he knows how to do a deal, Steve Witkoff. And he's going to be, we understand, the person who's going to Oman, not Marco Rubio, the U.S. Secretary of State. That would have been a significant development. But to send Steve Witkoff, President Trump is sending his top troublemaker, his main envoy, to turn his hand. And it has to be said, another very complex negotiation with a very long and very complicated history. And we've seen how when Steve Witkoff did an interview about Ukraine, he very much kept to Russia's talking points. So the big question is, how will he approach these talks with Iran? The Iranians, like the Russians, are very skilled negotiators. They have that reputation. They're also very sensitive about how political this is in Iran. So there's a lot of discussion now about, President Trump says they're going to be direct. The Iranians so far are repeatedly saying they will be indirect. But I keep thinking about Steve Witkoff's first visit to Israel. He arrived on Saturday morning, the Jewish Sabbath, to meet Prime Minister Netanyahu. He was told, I'm sorry, Mr. Witkoff, we're very glad to see you, but it's Saturday morning. It's the Sabbath. The Prime Minister doesn't hold meetings. And I won't use the words he used, but he basically said, I'm going to meet him. And so the whole program was, the conventions were turned upside down, and he went. Of course, Prime Minister Netanyahu broke the Sabbath. Well, didn't break it, but he had a meeting. And I'm sure that sort of real estate developer bulldozing in to get results. I think the Iranians this will be a very different kind of table for the Iranians, but equally, Steve Witkoff will meet a very different kind of negotiator on the other side of the table.
Yeah, I'm sure. Well, hopefully we'll be able to speak to you from there.
Yes,
Lyse,
good.
lovely to talk to you as always. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And that's all we've got time for today. But please, please keep your questions coming in. I mean, there are just so many different aspects of what President Trump is doing that affect all of us in so many different ways. And I'd love to hear from you and to hear what your questions are and what you want to know. So do get in touch with us. But for now, that's all from me. Bye-bye.